And this is something I've just kind of been trying to implement in my life. It's like, look, just try it. Even if it doesn't work, like the worst that's going to happen is maybe some people may, like you said, like you may get some hecklers or people booing you, but...
No, I want to be deadly clear about that. You're not going to get people booing you in an open mic room. It just doesn't happen. There might be one mouthy person who wants to shout out, and I would argue they're not even hecklers. They're probably there with a girlfriend or a bunch of drunken mates, and really they're just trying to show off in front of their friends. They're not hecklers in the way we perceive them in the truest sense, like in an open mic room. Those kind of things really aren't something new comedians should worry about.
Welcome back to the Intelligent Conversations podcast. As you can tell, we're going to continue with this format for a little bit, just to see how it works. I would appreciate your feedback, and if you're listening on Spotify, if you could answer the question if you like this format better, I'd appreciate it. Today, I have the honor to learn from Alfie Noakes. Alfie is the founder of the We Are Funny project, based in the UK. He has staged over 1,800 gigs, hosted over 10,000 performers, and created 30,000 spots for stand-ups. He loves all things comedy and uses that passion to provide coaching for comedy talent. Alfie is great in this episode. He had a lot of valuable things to share if you're looking to get into the comedy or just even you want to try something new, strike something off on your bucket list. Alfie is great. He talks everything you need to know about that, and we get some great insights from him that we can all learn from. I don't want to spoil the rest of the show, so without further ado, let's welcome Alfie Noakes to the show. So this is something I want to ask, like just off the bat, I want to ask you with. And that's, you say you're not a comedian, like I saw on your website and even like on Podmatch, but you also train them. So don't you have to be a comedian in a way to train comedians?
No. I am an absolute anomaly in the comedy world where I am a comedy coach. I've got now 3 online courses for comedians, but I'm not a comedian. Most people who teach are comedians who've reached maybe a certain level. They know some of the basics and they're ready to share them. There's a reason the world's big heavy hitters, whoever you might think of, Joe Rogan, Bill Burr, they don't have the time, the will or the need for the money to be teaching. The reason I'm able to be a teacher is because I started running a comedy night with a friend something well over 10 years ago. Did a handful of open mic gigs. I did very well the first time, and then I died the hardest death you could ever imagine the second. And I just quickly realised it wasn't for me. If I'm in, I'm serious about stuff, so I want to go all the way. Mm-hmm. And too many elements of being a successful comedian weren't for me. So what I actually did was I built up an open mic room. I think we started with my partner. It was 1 gig every 2 weeks. And then ultimately I split with him and I had it up to 6 gigs a week in 2 venues and brought in a whole new range of elements, specifically in-person workshops. So I would bring in professionals to teach aspects of comedy, initially emceeing. It would be aspects of, say, musical comedy, character comedy, writing for radio and TV. And in the years in between, I'd already slipped into the role as an MC. So
Gotcha.
Where my strength is I don't really have the failed ambition of being a comedian, but what I have been is up close and personal, watching an average of maybe 14 comedians a night, certainly in certain cases year after year, watching them progress, seeing what did and didn't work. And on any given show, I'm actually on stage longer than anybody else, usually including the headliner, because I'm on before every act. I'm coming back on after every act and linking it all together, wrapping up the show, and of course kicking off the show. So I'm good at the stories, the riffing with the crowd, all those kind of things, back referencing maybe a topic a comedian's just mentioned and coming up with something funny. But I'm not in the habit of kind of permanently being on the lookout for funny stuff, jotting that down on my notebook, writing it down, re-editing it, and rehearsing it, and then travelling across town. So I've got this unique position of watching the comedians, being on stage, well over 1,000 times, but also had the privilege of being in those workshops that I produced, learning lessons from those teachers, very often then going, right, they said not to do X. I'm on stage tomorrow night. I'm going to do X, see if they're right. And they indeed were correct every time. So I've made most of the mistakes, but really I've been a really close witness to thousands of acts being on my stage over the years.
So you've brought in other professionals as well, is what you said, like to teach, or are you teaching the comedians yourself?
No, so when we began doing it, I had so many shows that I wasn't able to sustain it as being our in-house MC myself. And as with all aspects of comedy, most aspects of life, really, your first is your worst. It took me a while to kind of really hit gear. I was probably naturally adept at it, but still there's skill sets and aspects that you only learn after time and experience, or possibly taking advice from experts. So I was producing workshops, bringing in professionals. So one of the best MCs in Britain would teach my MCing workshop. By the time I did that, probably about half of what he was teaching I'd already figured out. And then the other half I'm like, well, I don't know, that could be true, I'm not sure, let me test it. And then I would go and test it and find out they were correct. But for example, the guy who teaches my clowning workshop is a wonderful man called Dave Thompson. He was Tinky Winky in the Teletubbies. So if there was ever a qualification to teach clowning, I think that's probably it. For many years, a wonderful comedian here called Matt Price taught the comedy storytelling workshop. I've since taken over teaching that myself. The Perrier Award winner Scott Capurro teaches a workshop called Punch Up Your Stand-Up. So acts will come in, perform their 5 minutes and get immediate feedback from like a world-class pro. Scott's gracious enough and friendly enough that he would let me jump in and give any of my own observations and caveats. So I've been watching acts up close and personal. I've had the chance to learn at the knee of some amazing professional comedians, and we would run those workshops, very often more than once, many times. So I would get the lessons over and over, and I had the stage time that I was providing for myself to then go and test what didn't work, which is why I think I've got this unique angle on being able to teach.
I think that's cool. That oftentimes I like how you take the approach of you observe first of like what's working, what's not, right? I mean, kind of just that outside perspective helps, but then actually testing it, like you'll give that advice and then kind of see how it works with that person. Am I kind of hitting that right there where you yourself go and test out the ideas, or do
Well, it's two different skill sets. I've always been very clear, as you said at the beginning, I am not a comedian, but I am really immersed in the world of comedy and have been for a very long time now. So I've been able to witness people up close and personal. I've seen what didn't work. I've had the opportunity to watch them year upon year. So I've seen what the trajectory and the path is of a hard-working, committed, talented comedian. But equally, I've seen what really doesn't work. And then when I was in those workshops, I say most often it will be a case of taking something they said, don't do this. I remember one particular example was something you should absolutely never say. And it was going to be in regard to a female performer. Nothing awful, I want to be clear about that, but it was something you could imagine a lesser experienced MC or comedian could make the mistake. It's nothing egregious. So I spoke to one of my female friend comedians in the room who I was going to bring up on stage. And I said, look, here's what's happened. I've been given this advice not to do X. I want to do it. Can I do it while I bring you up? It's nothing personal, but it is a little bit, rude. And she said, yeah, no, of course, no problem, that's fine. And so I did it, and I got booed from a certain quarter of the room. And indeed, somebody took their lemon slice from their drink and threw it at me, and it stuck on my forehead. Just like a miracle shot, which is, one of the more twisted heckles I've had in my life. So I didn't think it would be such a contentious statement. It's nothing I'd ever said before. It's nothing I think I would have thought to say. But once I was told don't do it, I set the groundwork to make sure I didn't offend my friend. She was interested as much as I was as to see what kind of response it would get. And just time and again, these teachers are of such a high standard, I was able to say, yeah, they're right, don't do that. I'd mostly figured out what to do. I hadn't yet the experience or maybe the adventurousness to check out the things not to do. But every one of my teachers was right. There was never an example where I tested one of their theories and I was left wondering. They were always correct. So I had great privilege of having these amazing teachers. And, every time I found a new theme of comedy that I was interested in, maybe writing for the radio, writing comedy for the radio, then I would find an appropriate teacher, bring them in. We would obviously both get paid for the experience, but also I would get the experience for no charge.
That's so cool. I think that's so cool that you do that. So who are some of the comedians that you work with? Because when I was reading up on you, you've worked with thousands of comedians. Who would you say is some of your favorite you've worked with?
Well, let's be clear, my shows are open mic shows. So having been doing this for over 13 years, it's a very small proportion of people go through to make it to the professional realm. The standard is so very high. And then there's also more than just being a professional stand-up. A lot of the acts end up being, say, writers on a TV or a radio show, like current affairs, comedy shows and the like. And then they maybe gig on the club circuit, where, for my money, actually some of the finest comedians are found. You know, television requirements aren't necessarily going to bring you the very best comedians. I think many of the very best comedians are club comics, first and foremost. I'm not going to be too name-droppy, I've got to be honest, but there is a comedian who just, at the Edinburgh Festival this year, which is the Edinburgh Fringe, is the biggest arts festival in the world. It's a mecca for comedians all over the world. An actor who did his first ever gig with me, and it was clear his talent from the get-go. If you, in fact, you go on my website, wearefunnyproject.com, I wrote an article about him maybe a year ago, using him as an example as best practice, best attitude. This is how you rise through the ranks. It only took him something like 6 or 7 years from his first night on my stage to appearing on the biggest comedy show in the UK, which is live at the Apollo. So used him as a litmus test there. But in this year's Edinburgh Festival, he, for the second time, was nominated for the best show, which is largely unprecedented. So I've been able to kind of help nourish acts like that simply by giving them more stage time and maybe giving them a bit of advice and helping where I can. But let me be 100% clear, like, if they haven't got the work ethic and they haven't got the innate skill or the will to try and fail and challenge, it really is just 99% them. A good agent can help them. Somebody like me can help them in the beginning, but ultimately their success is absolutely their own, because comedy is truly a meritocracy. If you tell a joke and they don't laugh, then you know. If you tell a joke and you get rolling laughter, then you know. And then the secret is to try and get more of those jokes that generate rolling laughter and then pack them all together. But there are, certain elements of performing comedy that are truly universal. And I've been able to glean those, not just from the teachers that I was able to learn from, but as I say, I've watched probably about 10,000, something over 10,000 people have performed on my stage. So I've seen the worst car crashes possible. And I've seen, the most brilliant emerging talent, progress year upon year upon year. So, I've been able to work out a few patterns and traits, what does and doesn't work. And I've got a course, I've got 3 courses online, but one of them is what I consider to be the advanced course. And that I've developed a thing called the cinematic system of stand-up. Because in a former life, I was a movie journalist. I worked on most of the movie shows, I interviewed lots of movie stars, made documentaries about aspects of the cinema. Cool. And I quickly realised very early in comedy, when it was still very much a hobby, that there was an immense amount of overlap between cinema and stand-up. And so more than a decade later, I put all of that together. And that's an advanced course to show people how they can improve their writing, their performance through using cinematic techniques, and then also navigate the scene. If you want to get from open mic, obviously the amateur level, to being paid in the pro circuit, ultimately helps guide them towards what you might want to do to have best chance of getting a good agent.
That's cool. That's really cool. I like what you're doing. So how do you find kind of, I guess, these, like, the emerging talent, and how do you nurture it? Because I believe that, hard work, one, is just like you said, is going to be what shows if you're going to be successful or not. But I think you also have to have a little bit of, like, talent to begin with. And it's like something actually a basketball player said, Kevin Durant. He's like, look, talent is just nothing if you don't work on it. Like, it's just going to slowly fade away. But if you actually put the time and effort into it, then you can actually become something great. So how do you spot kind of these emerging talents and get them to actually work on their talent?
Well, you asked how do I find them, but they find me, because I run a night. And so if you're a comedian, you need to find a night like mine. Every comedian every comedian that's famous and successful that you've ever loved, they all began in open mic rooms. And so, because I provide stage time, anybody who's interested in starting in comedy, progressing in comedy, if they're geographically local to me, and I'm in the very centre of London, arguably the biggest, healthiest comedy scene in the world, they will ultimately come to me and ask me for stage time. And I've got a very open system. I just want to balance the bill appropriately, but I don't mind if somebody isn't particularly good. I've had over 500 people do their first gig in front of me. So I've got a fairly good sense of how that's going to play out for most people. But no, I don't find them. They find me, and they don't find me. They find a night called the We Are Funny Project, and will approach me just in the same way they would any other open mic night. And then if I happen to be the MC, of course, I'm watching every act close and personal. I tend not to try and give too much advice frankly, to many people. I mean, these days I sell my advice and my information.
Yeah.
But even back in the day, before I had these courses and I offered coaching as an opportunity, if I found an actor coming to my night fairly regularly and I found that I liked them, like off stage as well, and I could see they were working hard, you know, there can be really quite small things, but they can have a big effect. So, for example, if during somebody's set, they're trying to demonstrate somebody shouting, yeah, for example, they're reenacting an argument or somebody shouting at them in the street. It's only a small thing, but it makes a world of difference. If they shout into the microphone, then that just hurts the audience's ears because that's a shout through an amplified PA, you know. And so in that moment, the audience kind of cringe and pull out of the performance, the experience, and all that hard work they've put in to bring them into their comedic world is kind of sabotaged. So that's a small notion and an easy fix. So if I see an act who I personally like, I can see is working hard, and you know that one piece of advice can help them not make that error again and again, I will, you know, politely ask them, do you mind if I give you a piece of advice? Invariably they'll agree. I wouldn't just presume, and then I'll give them, you know, some kind of advice along those lines. But ultimately, their success is entirely in their own hands. It's about how hard they work. And also, let's be clear as well, you know, I've had criticism from professional comedians who, almost without exception, have been gracious enough to kind of step back from their original criticism because the pros are inclined to say, you can't teach funny. And my answer is always, but I can teach funnier. So somebody who is not particularly funny in day-to-day life, I can show, I think in my beginner's course, I think there's 7 joke writing exercises. And I'm really mindful, I don't just want to teach comedians how to be cookie cutters and the same as one another. That's pointless. My true belief is comedy is ultimately your take on the world. This is what I reckon, okay? Of course, it's not all true. So many fools on the internet get outraged at something a comedian has said. So much of it is about bizarre parallels and extreme exaggeration, all these other devices of comedy. So I find it, laughable, which is ironic, I guess, in the world of comedy, that people get necessarily annoyed at something a comedian said because it is not necessarily reflecting their truth. But when a comedian comes on stage, they should be presenting something of what they take on the world. And the very best of them, in my opinion, are going to do something that kind of changes our mind. You know, the prescribed belief system, the uniform take on X is this. And then a brilliant comedian can come in and go, I'm looking through this prism now. This is my filter. And actually, you've all missed the point. This is the truth with jokes.
I think Dave Chappelle actually summed this up pretty well, where he said, look, comedy is just art. Like, you're free to interpret it how you want. Mm-hmm. If you're upset by what I said, like, sorry, but other people find it funny and they pay me millions of dollars, like him especially, to say what I want to say. And I think that's important, that you don't want to lose. Like, if you start putting that your own filter on you, then you kind of lose. I
think a lot of people in the world fail to understand that they might not be the intended audience for something. So, for example, I have a teenage son who's very musically astute. He's got excellent taste, but I don't know, whoever the big boy band was when he was a bit younger, well, I think it was probably One Direction, Harry Styles.
One Direction, yeah.
And, you know, when he was that age and all the girls were crazy for Harry Styles and all, you know, he would slag them off. You've got to understand they're not for you, okay? So don't even bother wasting your breath criticising them. They're not for you. Find what you like and focus on that. It's just so easy to disparage artists when you're blind to the notion that they're not designed for you. There's no point. I know, for example, I used to be a film journalist. I know a lot about movies. I'm not particularly a fan of romantic films, romantic movies. They tend to lean more towards a female audience, for example. At one time in my life, this is true, believe it or not, I had a job reviewing nightclubs. I had to review 30 nightclubs every month for nearly 2 years. And the nature of that is most of those clubs only happen on a Friday or a Saturday, which meant I'd have to be at the first club at about 10, and I've got 2 hours to kind of check that club out and get to the next one, and I'd go all night. But by 10 o'clock, 10:30, that club hasn't really kicked off. It's very hard for me to assess, is it that good a club? And then you send me to, say, a drum and bass night. Well, I'm not a fan of drum and bass music. I actively dislike it. So how am I going to give a fair review of that? And then my best solution was to talk to paying punters and get their take on it and try and get something of a consensus and represent their thoughts. So it wasn't just for me. But it became clear over time, you know, most art has its target market. Yes, of course, we've got the Star Wars and the Harry Potters and the Marvel films that are truly global and universal. Who doesn't like a dinosaur film, you know? But by and large, most art, whatever art we're talking about, has a specific target audience in mind. In fact, something I speak about in the advanced course, Stepping Forward in Stand-Up Comedy, is recognising the quadrants. There's 4 quadrants, by definition, that Hollywood will take into account when they're deciding to greenlight a film and how to market a movie. And it is ostensibly young, old, male and female. So if you look at a film, say, as a Fast and the Furious, of course there are exceptions, but by and large, it's a 2-quadrant movie, young and male. Okay, if you get a very popular piece of intellectual property, such as, say, Marvel characters, you know, the Hulk has been there in our culture for 50 or so years, I guess, you know, that will appeal to men in their 60s because they remember reading that book when they were a kid, that comic book when they were a kid. So at that point, you've probably got young, old, skews male, but certainly a certain amount of females are likely to like it. So those big movies are 4-quadrant movies. And you can apply this theory to most art forms, most certainly music. Adele, wonderful as she is, I'm a big fan, but tends to lean towards a female audience, arguably even an elder female audience. So before people go around disparaging art and artists, they might want to kind of check with themselves, who is it aimed for? And if it's not me, I should probably save my breath.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is just a thought I had, and that's, I'm kind of curious now. I'm guessing this is why the books come first before the movies, because Hollywood realizes, oh, the people that really enjoyed this book, and you know, the book did well, they're older now, and they're going to go and watch this movie because they're just fans of it. And then maybe there's this younger audience as well that will also go and watch it. And like you said, it hits multiple, and that's how we get kind of our global brands like Star Wars and Marvel and Harry Potter, you know, things like that. And I'm a big Star Wars nerd. I will say that. That's, I think, what was it? I saw one thing where it's like everyone falls into 3 categories. It's either they're a Star Wars fan, Marvel, or Lord of the Rings, or Harry Potter. If they don't fall into one of those 4, then they're one wacky person.
I guess, the first time I ever saw at the cinema was Star Wars, when I was 3 years old. I mean, I was of that generation. Star Wars is okay. I think it's probably more successful than it merits. But speaking of kind of the quadrants, the way you were saying, is like, let's be clear, Star Wars is different from Marvel. For this reason, and Harry Potter for the same reason that I'm about to give, is Star Wars was self-created. In 1977, when the film came out, there was nothing before that. People just heard this film was great and immediately started queuing around the block. We had created the blockbuster, either that or Jaws, depending who you listen to. And that was its own success straight out of the gate. But if you look at something like Marvel, and I used a Hulk a second ago, I'm sure this could apply equally to, say, Spider-Man and the rest, is it began as a comic book. And I don't know when exactly, I'm going to guess the 50s and 60s. So that will be a generation reading that comic book. And then in 1970s, you definitely had a television show of the Hulk. And then there were certainly cartoons of the Hulk, I guess, in the 80s. And then, so there you go, you've got a 40-year window of people being familiar with that property, that intellectual property. So that's kind of ingrained and built up over generations. The success of something, as you mentioned, Harry Potter and Star Wars, they were successes out of the blue. They were just there because, you know, it hit the right target audience and they were of a suitable quality.
So here's a question here is, how do comedians kind of, I guess, create that? Have you ever seen anyone successfully, like any comedian, do that, where they can go through generations and then even after they die, they can kind of preserve that legacy? I don't know what.
Have I ever seen a comedian succeed in holding an audience over generations?
Yeah.
Is that the question?
Yes.
Yeah, well, the one that immediately springs to mind is George Carlin. He began.
Heard of him.
you've heard of him, you should certainly watch him. I mean, I need to be clear, stand-up comedy tends to not age so well. So what might be your favourite comedy of the day? You've already referenced Dave Chappelle while we're chatting. So if he's one of your current favourites, fantastic, I'm a fan as well. But maybe in 30 years' time you might have teenage kids or something, I don't know, and you turn them on to him, I promise you they're not going to like it as much as you do today, because I've been through that experience trying to show my son Bill Hicks. Comedy just doesn't age so well, partly because it's often so very current to the culture we have around us. But George Carlin is absolutely considered to be one of the greats of comedy, and rightly so. And he famously went through various iterations where he was originally in a double act. Danny Kaye, kind of a 50s film star, was his big hero. He wanted to be the next Danny Kaye. But then he went through this kind of counterculture 60s hippie mode, and he veered all over the place. Not all over the place, but back and forth, and very much settled as a counterculture voice until he sadly died about, I think, probably 12 or 15 years ago now. But he remained a salient, current, and entertaining voice right the way through to the end. But he was very middle of the road, uncontroversial for a long time, and then he reinvented himself. So that's somebody who's managed to sustain themselves. There's lots of comedians with 30 and plus year careers, which is about as good as it ever gets for an A-list Hollywood star. There's very few of them last more than 10 years at the A-list level. In film, in comedy, they can already build up their audiences. As far as lasting that long, yeah, there's quite a few of them around. I mean, some of the bigger comedians here in the UK that I would think of, Stuart Lee is considered to be one of our very best. And he seems to have a cycle, something he's acknowledged himself, that he becomes very popular again about every 7 years. And I think he's now in about his 5th cycle of being that super popular comedian. And, you know, it's no surprise because he's fantastic.
That's true. It's true. So for someone that's looking to get into comedy, I mean, obviously they just got to get in front of that open mic. I think that's step one, and practice. But I think a lot of them have these dreams, right, of kind of being like the next big comedian. How would they do that?
First of all, I'd point out that actually a huge amount of people who perform stand-up comedy don't really have high professional ambitions. A large amount of the circuit are people who this is their hobby, and this is their tribe, this is their people. They enjoy going out of an evening. In another universe, maybe they'll play golf or be part of a rugby team, or they do a pottery class, whatever it might happen to be. But this is what they do, and they go out and they try and make the audience laugh, as obviously every comedian should. They stick around the scene a while, some of that audience as some of their friends, and then when they're not on stage, they're being made to laugh by people they do or don't know, and then they stick around for drinks with their new friends or long-term friends, as it might be, after the show. It's only it's certainly a minority of people who start open mic who really, really have professional ambitions. Some people just want to sharpen up their public speaking skills. They just promise themselves they'd have a go. It was a bucket list thing, and then they had a go and they really liked it. But whether it's because they just don't have the ambition, they recognise they don't have the absolute tip-top skill set to be a pro, maybe they're a little bit later along in life and they recognise it's not practical to think you can be a world-famous comedian if you only begin in your 50s. And let me be clear, there are plenty of open mic comedians of very high quality, I would point out, who did begin in their 50s. They're not likely to make the leap from an open mic room to playing live at the Apollo, as I mentioned earlier. But they can be a highly recognised, highly regarded figure on their quote-unquote scene within their comedy community. So with that addressed, that not everybody who does open mic has ambitions to become a world-famous professional. They're in fact a minority. Those who will become... shall we agree the standard is being professional, as in this is how you make your living, as opposed to necessarily having a Netflix special or something, because that's the very peak of the peak. You know, there's only fewer than 100 comedians in the world who reach that kind of level. But to make a living out of it, again, it's a very small percentage of those who ever perform open mic for even a year. You know, I think most people who try it are wise enough to do it at least. I always recommend you should do it at least, if you're going to do it at all, at least half a dozen times. That first gig, it doesn't matter how it goes at all. I know it matters to the act, but they're the only person in the room who really cares. That gig is so much more about just showing themselves they've got the courage and the stones and the bravery to do it. If they get some laughs, fantastic. But that's just about crossing the psychological Rubicon of getting over the fear of it. Bottom line is the audience don't really care in an open mic room how you do. They're just not that invested. And the other comedians have all been there. They've all done their first gig. They've all had a gig that went bad. So if anything, they kind of empathise. They're certainly going to kind of enjoy the fact that there's not some new competition in town taking spots that they might have had. So doing half a dozen gigs, you've got a sense of how it works. You know, you don't talk too quickly all the way through the set like you did the first time, and you can get a true feeling for it. And at that point, you might decide if you want to persevere and do 2 or more nights a week, and by which you will obviously become better. And when you become better, it's a much more rewarding experience. Those who are committed should be gigging as much as they possibly can. Stage time is everything. I've got fantastic information. I run really great workshops with wonderful professionals, but it's all theory. If you don't actually get on a stage and apply it in front of an audience, read the room, get a sense of the vibe, you know, check for the timing, all of the other things that go with it. So stage time is absolutely fundamental. So those who are truly intent on becoming world-class professionals, or indeed just a professional, need to be gigging as often as they can, as frequently as they can. An absolute thing is to record your sets and then listen back. If you didn't get the laugh you wanted, then you need to review as to why. Very often you'll get a laugh where you weren't expecting. And there's a lesson to be learned there, and maybe you just improvised something, riffed something, and it really worked. Well, you can keep that for your next set. As with everything, practice makes perfect, and as you go on, you know, you pick up some skills. But the reason I made these courses, I made the first 2 during lockdown. You know, I wasn't able to run shows, and over the years, you know, hundreds and hundreds of comedians have come and asked me a question about this or that, and also in the workshops. You know, I've produced that clowning workshop well over a dozen times, and still the comedians would raise questions about hecklers. Now, I don't know what kind of monster would heckle a clown, but that's a universal concern for new comedians, and it's one that I can really reassure them about quickly, is there's very little heckling in an open mic room. You know, a big proportion of the audience are other comedians waiting to go up. So if somebody starts getting mouthy in the audience, it's not just the act on stage that's got to handle them. You're likely to get an MC like me coming on afterwards, and I'm more than capable of handling a mouthy heckler on behalf of the act. And then the other acts in the room are sitting in the crowd, probably somewhere near and around that heckler. You know, they're not going to be laughing along in approval. They'll be giving off the vibe, you might want to tone it down, mate, because they're going up soon and they don't want the heckler either. So I've been able to kind of corral all of these common questions, the most common questions, the most common concerns. And then, you know, with the amount of time I had in the lockdown, really kind of work it out, flesh it out, and put it down in a step-by-step structure. So for somebody wanting to start comedy, was your original question, certainly go to an open mic night. There is no other way in. Really, the question might be is how much preparation do you want to do? Of course, you want to write, most often or not, it's a 5-minute set that you want to do. The chances are you're going to be so nervous that first set that you'll end up talking 20% faster than you normally do. So while you were practicing in your bedroom or your kitchen and you timed it out at 5 minutes, almost certainly you'll be leaving the stage after 4 minutes because you've spoken so much more quickly. This is the kind of advice that I already pack into my beginner's course, stepping into stand-up comedy. So that gives not just advice on how to write material and how to perform it, and there's plenty of that, but it also gives tips on how to navigate the scene and information such as I've just given you. You know, when you walk up on stage, if you're feeling remotely nervy, it might feel counterintuitive, but slow your speech down by about 20%, which is entirely ironic because I'm naturally a fast-talking person, as you've probably gathered by now, Josh.
Oh, I am too. Don't worry about that. And I bet the internet's helped with that as well. Like, now all of a sudden, I'm sure you've had comedians all around the world probably reach out to you saying, or taking your workshops and just checking out your website. I mean, here we are, right, on different sides of the world talking to each other about comedy. And one thing I like that you said was recording yourself. I've even found this in podcasting. You just got to record yourself, because then when you listen to yourself, you find out, you're like, okay, I said it that way. I didn't really like it that way. And it gives you valuable feedback. And like you said, maybe people started laughing at it, something you said that you improvised on the spot, and you're like, oh, wait, maybe I should do this more often. and that feedback's very helpful.
Yeah, I think there's probably something of an overlap between podcasting and comedy, because you're in the zone, you're in the moment, you're focusing on me and me alone right now, with probably your subtler voice inside thinking what the next question is or what you want to respond to that I've just said. And when a comedian's on stage, particularly early days comedians, they're very much making sure they're remembering the script and they know what comes next. You know, trying to get a sense of the room. Are they laughing? Are they not? Did I say this yet? There's this terrible thing for many performers where, you know, let's imagine you had an audience of 100 people exactly, and you're rocking the gig, you're blowing the lid off the place. One person's looking miserable and unhappy, and it's just the comedian's burden just to be focusing on that person, sadly not allowing themselves to enjoy the 99 people who are loving what they're doing. Listening back to whatever you do and record, in your case as a podcast host, you're going to be able to spot the things you can see with kind of a fresh perspective as opposed to being in the moment. It's true of almost anything. I think I said it already in this interview. The first time is the worst time in almost everything we do. Okay, the first time we've done it, we're going to make some of the major mistakes. Great, we recognise what they are, iron them out as best we can. Go to the second time, maybe it's 30% better. Record it, pay attention, go again, maybe you're 20% better the next time. Ultimately, the law of diminishing returns, but that means those first half a dozen times you're making really significant steps. And if you compare to, say, the 6th or the 10th gig to the first, neither of them may be very good yet, that's fine. But there will be a notable improvement from the 1st to the 6th, 1st to the 10th.
It's so true, and you just have to, and this is something I've just kind of been trying to implement in my life. It's like, look, just try it. Even if it doesn't work, like, the worst that's going to happen is maybe some people may, like you said, like, you may get some hecklers or people booing you, but...
No, I want to be deadly clear about that. You're not going to get people booing you in an open mic room. It just doesn't happen. There might be one mouthy person who wants to shout out, and I would argue they're not even hecklers. They're probably there with a girlfriend or a bunch of drunken mates, and really they're just trying to show off in front of their friends. They're not hecklers in the way we perceive them in the truest sense, like in an open mic room. Those kind of things really aren't something new comedians should worry about. But yes, I do appreciate if you're putting your art out, you know, the comments section on so much of social media, that would be a version of kind of online heckling or criticism, sadly.
Yeah. So how would you deal with kind of, I guess, criticisms if you decide, like, to put it out there on the socials? Because I think I've found that there's two types, at least, of criticisms. There's one that's actually, like, helpful. It's like, hey, why don't you try this? And it hurts, right? It's like, oh, crap.
Constructive criticism, which is incredibly valued in all aspects of our world. As long as it's coming from a good place and the advice is sincere and ideally well informed, then that's exactly how we get better. That's how we learn to walk, ride our bikes, and everything else. Yeah. Constructive criticism isn't just helpful, it's invaluable.
I agree. And then there's the flip side too, where they'll say something, and this is kind of how I've tried to discern, I guess, from comments, is the one, it's actually like helpful constructive criticism, and then there's just people that are kind of looking for a reaction or just trying to be mean. And they'll just say something that kind of, I guess, insults you as a person. And it's like, okay, that doesn't really help me at all. Like, I can't improve off this. But it still hurts, right? And I don't know, how would you deal, I guess, kind of with that, like the two?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't read any comments. I only have a limited social media presence. I mean, as I mentioned before, I worked in television for all those years, and specifically in film. So I already spent way too many years watching films to then go and film something about the film and then go into an edit suite, windowless edit suite for days, and then edit something about the film. So by the time I was 30, I had spent far too much time in front of a screen. So I'm really disinclined to spend too much time on social media. That speaks to me in my generation. I respect that entirely. But if you recognise that somebody's written something just to be horrible, why would you give a shit about their opinion? Okay, if that's their singular motivation, who cares? You know, I worked something of a film critic for a while, for quite some time, and then I ultimately realised how pointless that is as an occupation, even though it's something that I worked really hard towards, because I very quickly came to realise that there's only a limited amount of value to something like film criticism. Okay, and obviously in the world of the internet, and I was doing this, I was something like the IMDb in human form before the IMDb existed and the internet was popular. That's how I got my break in television, because I knew so much about movies, and that became my niche. When I was working as a film critic, I realised that it's only got limited value. One is for the record, you know, this is what film critics thought of X movie, and we can go back and see how wrong they were. Many critics slated the film Psycho. You know, in the early 80s, they slated Blade Runner and the Blues Brothers, which are regarded as modern classics, and so many people have loved them for the last 40 plus years. Then another sense is you're just writing for your audience or producing for your audience. First film review I ever was commissioned to write in a magazine in print form. I first did TV and radio, but I print. It was for a Brad Pitt film called Legends of the Fall, and I wrote this really, what I thought was a smart review of this Brad Pitt, Anthony Hopkins movie, and they sent it back and went, no, this is for a teen girls magazine, do it again. And I'm like, oh, I've already got to write 400 words about how dreamy Brad looks and how lush his hair is, and I rewrote it with that in mind, and they accepted it. So that was really skewed by the audience, not my true opinion, which taught me a lot. And then the other time it's valuable, and this is its most value, is when there's consensus. If all the critics are saying this is a movie worth seeing, guess what? It probably is. If they're all saying it's rubbish, guess what? It probably is. If they're divided, just go and watch the film and make up your own mind. You know, if somebody's giving you horrible comments and you don't know them and you've got no reason to respect them, why would you give them a second's thought? That's the modern ill of the internet, I guess. It's a little bit harder for a comedian in a room because they've gone up there with a hard intent of making them laugh, and it's definitely going to happen that they're going to have hard gigs. It's an absolute given. Again, I have a blog on my website, which is how to handle a bad gig. You know, it's essential. There's no comedian out there that hasn't had a slew of bad gigs in their experience. Yeah, they're hard to take, but the good news is these are the gigs that you learn the most from, and you build up a certain amount of armour. And when you're hanging out with other comedians, they never want to hear about the amazing gig you had last week where you blew the lid off the place and they were chanting your name, which is a rare experience anyway. They just want to hear about the gig that went wrong. You know, that's what the rest of the comedians in the community want to hear. They just want to hear about the bad gig. And even the world's greatest have bad gigs. You know, most of the truly world-famous comedians, the Chris Rocks and the Joe Rogans and all, these are clearly talented comedians who can get on any stage at any time they like because of who they are, and it'll still take them 2 years to come up with a new special, which lasts something of about an hour plus long. So if they're already talented, very seasoned, can get on any stage they like at any time, and it takes them 2 years to generate an hour, then I think most people who want to try open mic can cut themselves some slack that 2-3 nights a week for a year should get them to their first tight five, where they're going to get reliable laughs at a steady rhythm all the way through their set. And that's a hell of a feeling when you achieve that. You know, this is a chance to feel like a rock star when you're not a rock star. Exactly.
And it kind of goes back to Malcolm Gladwell's, I don't know if you've read his book Outliers, but it takes about 10,000 hours to get good at something. And yeah, be patient with yourself. And if,
I've got to jump in on that though. If you think about the 10,000 hours, I've thought about this many a time. 10,000 hours in stand-up comedy is almost impossible, because when you're an open mic, by and large, there are differences between cities and countries, but by and large, open mic spots are 5 minutes. So that's 12 nights you have to go out to be able to perform for just 1 hour. Okay, so that's going to be, what's that quick maths, 120,000 nights you'd have to go out performing at 5 minutes a time to get to those 10,000 hours, and that's just not practical. Now, as you do get better, and you're probably in year 2, and you're what I consider phase 2, maybe a slightly more advanced level, you might be performing in 10-minute sets, and later on you might be doing 20-minute open spots until you start headlining, depending on the club, 25, 40 an hour, whatever it might happen to be. But yeah, there's very few comedians in the world who actually have 10,000 hours of stage time. It's just not a thing in the world of comedy.
Huh. That's true. Now that you kind of put that into 120,000 nights, I don't even think people live that long. Right? Yeah, that's for sure. And I think even with the internet, I mean, they could, I guess, do recordings, but I mean, that's just not the same, I would guess, as an open mic. And
well, you need a real audience in front of you. I mean, that's one of the reasons, I guess, I mean, amongst many, that I found myself shifting from being a director and a producer and an editor and all the things I did in the media. Because it was so focused on being on a screen, I'm either looking through a camera viewfinder, I'm in an edit suite looking at a bank of monitors, I'm at a film screening watching the film that I'm going to be talking about or reporting on. Whereas the comedy experience is purely a live experience. Like, it only works if there's a real audience in that room responding to you. Of course, you want the response to be the glorious, wonderful, heart-filling sense of them laughing and smiling and enjoying your show and your ideas and little nods of encouragement. Yes, that happens to me as well, but nobody else ever said it. Thank you, you know. That's an amazing experience, but it's a live experience. Any comedy, stand-up comedy, that is recorded and then you end up watching on a screen, I think is diminished by at least 50%. The vibe, the energy of the room, the rumbling of the other people laughing in the room, like, that's lost. It's a truly live experience. Yes, it can be replicated on screen. Of course, there's 1,000 shows and DVDs, as it were, back in the day, specials, Netflix specials and the like. And they capture it. They do the best they can, but it's never the same as being in the room, either for an act or for audience.
That's true. Well, Alfie, I want to thank you for coming on. This has been great. I appreciate you chatting with me and all that. If people want to reach out to you, book with your club, whatever it may be, what's the best way they can find you, reach out to you?
Well, I can be emailed, Alfie, ALFIE, at wearefunnyproject.com. But fundamentally, we're on the usual socials, but nearly everything's at the website, wearefunnyproject.com. And if somebody's interested in getting started in comedy, or even if they're not, if they've started and they're just not quite sure how to level up and keep going, if you join the mailing list, there's a new ebook I've just published, or I'm about to publish, 8 ways to turbocharge your stand-up comedy. There's some free video samples from the courses on there, and then there's a slew of blogs covering all sorts of aspects of comedy. So it's a bit of a one-stop shop with resources, and if you happen to be in London or can make it to London, then there's the in-person workshops, and the coaching and the online courses can of course be done anywhere in the world.
All right, as you can tell, that is Alfie Noakes. He's a very intelligent person, has great things to share. I challenge you guys, if anything spoke to you or anything resonated with you or you wanted to enter the comedy industry, that Alfie's your guy. He dropped the information there for you if you'd like to get started. I challenge you guys to do that and actually put some action behind it. Stay tuned till next week. We have a great guest lined up for you guys. See you guys next week, and let's get after it. Hey everyone, if you liked this episode and would like to hear more, be sure to hit that subscribe or follow button.